Okay. Let's have everyone, should we shut the door or maybe we'll leave it open for a few more people? So thank you all for coming tonight. This is part one of New Jersey 11th for Change's Defending Democracy series, and it's heartening to see so many faces here in the room. For the new people, New Jersey 11th for Change is a grassroots organization dedicated to fostering an engaged and educated community that will choose transparent, responsive, and accountable people to represent us. On the engagement side, we're laser focused right now, as you can imagine, on get out the vote efforts, and a lot of you are the warriors who are doing that every day and every night. And our education work is widespread, but includes events like this that we hope will inform and motivate people to get out and get involved. If you'd like to join us or support our work, you can stop by the table on your way out. So we couldn't be more excited about tonight's speakers. We have with us Mike German, who's a former FBI agent, ACLU civil rights lobbyist, author, and a fellow with the Brennan Center. Mike's currently working on his second book, The FBI's Disruption Strategy, which is due out in spring of 2019. Mike will be interviewed by Julie Burstein, who is a Peabody Award-winning radio producer, TED speaker, and best-selling author. Julie's newest project is Raising Our Voice Today, working with artists and illustrators to create posters and postcards to use in demonstrations. And they're awesome. Is it RaisingOurVoices.today?
RaisingOurVoices.today.
Yeah. And tonight's discussion, as you know, focuses on our intelligence agencies, what's been done in our name since 9/11, where we are today under the Trump administration, and how the way forward is through building up our local communities like we're doing this evening. So without further ado, please join me in giving Mike and Julie a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you everybody for coming out on a Tuesday night to hear this. Mike, I saw you working with your microphone, and in the green room, Mike said, "Oh yeah, I used to wear these under my pants." So you're an old hand. We didn't need to worry about that part. In the next hour, we're going to take a deep dive into the world that you've been deep into because you've been writing about it. But I wanted to start with something that you said to me when we had a brief conversation as we prepared for tonight's event. And so I called Mike on the phone, and we had a long conversation. And at the end, you said something I've never heard from a guest before, which is, "I've done research on you," which is very unusual for me to...
FBI agent.
Exactly.
That's right.
And you said, "I see that you focus on creativity, and creativity is the reason I got into the FBI." So that's where I want to start, is how did creativity get you into the FBI?
So I grew up in the military. My dad was an Army officer, West Point graduate, and I was very anti-authoritarian, which wasn't a very good place to be if you're anti-authoritarian.
Yeah.
But was always very well behaved. I had to be well behaved, but was always looking for different ways of doing things. If somebody said, "Well, the way you do that is you go from here to there," I was trying to find a better way.
You were saying maybe this way around the corner.
And this was in the at the end of the Cold War, the late 80s, and I knew, having grown up in the post-Vietnam era of the military, that we would never get involved in a foreign war that would turn into a quagmire. So wanting to work in government and serve the FBI seemed like a place where I could use the talents that I had in a way that made our community safer. And it attracted me particularly to undercover work, because that was a very creative way of always trying to solve a problem and having to think very far outside the box to make it work in situations that I was not normally used to.
So you spent 16 years with the FBI, and you left in 2004. What was it that made you decide to leave at that point?
The way that the FBI and the entire government were reacting to 9/11. I'd spent a number of years undercover with domestic terrorist groups and understood terrorism as a tactic. The goal of terrorism isn't just to kill people, it's to force a reaction out of the government that the way they would put it, will expose their illegitimacy, will expose them as being hypocrites, will expose the fact that the law is used to keep some people down and to let other people get away with things. So the way we were reacting to 9/11 troubled me very much, but it also troubled me because the people inside the FBI were the least surprised that our intelligence capabilities had so diminished. And the one silver lining we were looking for is this is an opportunity to really remake the way we're doing it, but the way that they remade it was increasing their power and reducing their oversight. And I knew that from history that would be a very troubling thing, and tried to raise questions from the inside and challenge these things, which made me very unpopular. and eventually I realized it was time for me to go and find something else, and luckily found the ACLU, which in a long about way is what brought me here, because Lori and I worked together there. So
I want to back up a little bit
Sure.
to something you said, which I guess I'd thought about a little bit, but not enough, which is that as you were working undercover with these groups who were doing things to provoke a reaction, with 9/11, do you feel like the reaction that happened was exactly what they were looking for?
Absolutely. You don't have to believe me. This was my first book. I wrote about, they had a manual about what they wanted to accomplish, and we went along with what they wanted us to do. You know, they wanted the U.S. to, think about it. After, in 2000, they blew a hole in the USS Cole in a port in Aden, Yemen. This was an operation that didn't cost a lot of money. It cost 2 people's lives. The 2 suicide bombers killed 19 sailors and almost sank a U.S. battleship. And yet they considered it a failure. And it's like, why would they consider that a failure? That's an incredibly successful effort. Well, it was a failure because they wanted the U.S. to invade a Muslim country. And the U.S. didn't invade a Muslim country, so they considered it a failure. And understanding that giving them what they want isn't the answer. And these were a group of somewhat crackpots who kept talking about the global war that they wanted to start, and handing them a global war didn't make things better for anyone.
I think this is going to be a theme for tonight, which is when terrible things happen, we do fall into the patterns that I guess people are expecting us to fall into. And it is partly the work now to think about how do we hold ourselves back from that immediate reaction.
Well, I think it's hard, and it's particularly hard in a democracy, which is why terrorism is successful against democracies, is because there is an outrage in the public and they want something done. So for the people responsible to do something, doing something is better than doing nothing, even if that something in the short term, much less the long term, is actually creating more harm. And unfortunately what you have are, it's fascinating to talk to people today. When I was growing up, the intelligence community was still very young, right? We had the Church Committee investigation. That was the first time most Americans got a peek at what goes on, and they didn't like it, right? They were very concerned about what was happening, and we put a lot of checks together.
And that's the church.
Sure.
I focus on creativity, so the Church Committee is a new. Tell us about that.
So the Church Committee, so in the early 1970s, there were a couple of college professors who burglarized an FBI office and released some documents showing that the FBI was spying on student groups. And that sort of started a lot of questions about what the FBI was doing at the same time. Cy Hirsch was writing about some of the abuses of the CIA, some of the military abuses in Vietnam were coming out, and then Watergate. So you had this effort in Congress where they said, we need to understand how this new thing we've created, this post-World War II establishment that we've created, is working, and what's going right and what's going wrong. So they established a committee in the House called the Pike Committee, and a committee in the Senate called the Church Committee, after Frank Church, the senator who was in charge. And I'm very fortunate because at the Brennan Center I work with Fritz Schwartz, who was the chief counsel to the church committee. So he's a hero of mine. I get to talk with him every day. It's quite a luxury. But a bunch of rules got put over how that worked. And as soon as the rules were put together, there was pressure against them. So gradually they started getting weaker. But 9/11 was the time that they said, oh, it was the rules that were the problem, get rid of the rules. When I knew, having worked, so in the FBI we had Attorney General guidelines that required me to have a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity before I could go undercover and start gathering information about people. And when people would say, oh, you know, I would always say, if you can't say why you think they're doing something bad, there's somebody worse out there. Go investigate them. A reasonable suspicion. You know, most FBI agents wake up suspicious, right? It's not really a very high standard. And to take that away means you're now targeting people you don't have a basis to believe they're doing something wrong. You just don't like them. And unfortunately, the way people tend to look at people who aren't like them, don't look like them, don't think like them as a threat, that opened the door for the kind of abuses that unfortunately we've seen since 9/11.
And that's what you're writing about now, is
Right.
what's happening within and what's happened within
Right.
the agency. What were the initial things when you were still at the FBI that you saw that began your concern about what was going on?
So almost immediately after 9/11, the FBI went out and arrested somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 Muslim immigrants. And the statement that then Attorney General John Ashcroft said was, you know, if you jaywalk, we're going to arrest you. We're going to find any reason to go arrest you, which right away I knew is exactly what Al-Qaeda wants. That, you know, they're trying to argue that Muslim Americans and Middle Eastern Americans and Arab Americans aren't fully American. And the divide is between us and them. And so for the US government to go out and implement policies that reinforce that, I right away knew was troubling. And of course, the Guantanamo Bay, the black sites, the torture, were all handing them victories that they could say, see, they didn't really believe in a rule of law. They didn't really believe in human rights. They used those as tools to suppress. And once you provoke them, they abandon them. So if they don't have to follow the law, we don't have to follow the law. And we can make our own law because whatever their justification is.
So after 9/11, I know that there was such an atmosphere of fear in this country. Is that a piece of this too, that these abandoning rules happens when people get particularly afraid?
So there is a lot of research about how fear influences decision making. And it's interesting because it creates a us and them sort of thinking, that who's the enemy and who is us. And unfortunately in the United States, that often breaks down around racial lines, it breaks down around ideological lines, and that's part of it. And then there's the government wanting to protect itself, right? So it's hard to go back to that time, but it wasn't until 2001 the attacks happened. It wasn't until 2004 when the 9/11 Commission came out with their report that's 500 pages, because the intelligence community knew a lot of what was going on, and it was an information management problem, not an information collection program. But by that time, it was too late, because immediately after 9/11, Congress passes the Patriot Act, and they're starting to collect massive amounts of information, which is because they were portraying it as a collection problem. The church committee rules didn't let us collect the information we need, when what you had was mismanaged information. So now you have a lot more information, but the same mismanagement going on. That's why every time there's an event, whether it's a terrorist attack or a school shooting like in Parkland, what we find is, yeah, there was a lot of people saying, there's something wrong here, you should do something, and it's just not reacted to properly. So we've created a system that is continually going to fail, and the response is always, well, give them more power. Let them have more data, give them more. And there hasn't been an effort to try to look at why is it that they continue to fail, and why is it that, and what damage is it doing to our society that we have this agency that knows more about us than we know about it.
After 9/11 and in these years, so it sounds like secrecy and being able to do things without oversight has become more and more rampant within the agency.
And not just the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, the entire intelligence community, and even groups you wouldn't think of. The Treasury Department has this very secretive program of collecting suspicious activity reports in banking that before 9/11 they would submit about 60,000 a year. After now there's around 1.2 million a year. So the scope of this collection is just enormous, and nobody is really, even, you know, I mean, as a civil libertarian, I worry about the rights of innocent people, but even if you're just a good government person who wants to know how the government is spending its money, you know, why do we have these vast programs? You know, one of the Patriot Act authorities was what they called Section 215, which allowed the government to collect on a daily basis all telephone metadata. So everyone you called, how long you called them, where you called, the numbers you called, everything is being collected every day. And they did this for 11 years.
On everybody?
On everybody in the United States. And when the program was finally leaked by Edward Snowden, Congress said, well, wait a minute, what about this program? And the government came out and said, it helped us stop 53 plots. And, you know, right away, well, you're gathering billions of telephone records. 53 plots doesn't really sound like a lot. But finally, Senator Leahy looked into it, and he got Keith Alexander, who was then the head of the NSA, on the stand, and he said, you know, isn't it true, now that we know what these plots are, that they're not all plots, and they weren't all stopped. And in fact, there's only one case that you can point to that involved that this particular power was essential to stopping something, and that was $1,500 being sent to Somalia by an American. And Keith Alexander said, no, I'm pretty sure there were two cases.
Oh!
Right? Which, you know, okay, now we can get rid of that program, and they've since modified it, but if you have something that doesn't work, why are we doing it, right? There are bad people out there. I mean, having been an FBI agent, I know that there are criminals out there. You know, we should be going after them, and unfortunately we're not. And it's fascinating because one of the things that I thought with all this massive surveillance was that they would solve a lot of regular street crime, you know, regular kind of crime. It would be much easier to find. But actually, if you look at it, prosecutions have gone way down since 9/11, and consistently down. And you know, it's amazing the way candidate Donald Trump talked about crime in the United States, and most Americans believe crime is rising, but this is actually one of the safest periods ever in the United States. And of course, as New Yorkers, we know this. In New Jersey, you know, that New York is an incredibly safe city compared to the way it was 30 years ago. There are still problems. Baltimore and Chicago in particular have bad problems, but overall, nationwide, crime is way, way down. The homicide rate has dropped so much, but as the homicide rate dropped, the homicide solve rate dropped. So we're solving less homicides now than we were when we had 1,000 a year. So where last year, 40% of US homicides went unsolved. If you talk about rapes, 60% of reported rapes go unsolved. And we have rape kits sitting on crime shelves all across the country untested because that's not national security.
And so if we look at homicide rates versus rates of people being injured or killed by terrorists, what's that ratio?
It's remarkably low. I mean, there are very few terrorist attacks in the United States and very few homicides from terrorism. We're talking a dozen, maybe 2 or 3 dozen a year. There are outlying events like Omar Mateen's shooting, if you want to call that terrorism. Obviously we have mass shootings, but even mass shootings, which far outpace terrorism, are only about 250 homicides, when annually we have about 15,000 homicides. So it's this very tiny segment that we focus a lot of resources on without recognizing. In 2011, there was a triple homicide in Waltham, Massachusetts, on September 11th, 2011. That homicide wasn't solved. In 2013, there was the Boston Marathon bombing, and the guy who was pointed out by witnesses, somebody who would know something about that 2011 homicide, was Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who was the Boston Marathon bomber. And there's all this predictive analytics that they're doing with this data, where I would argue if you've killed 3 people in the past, that's probably a pretty good indicator you're a dangerous person who we need to investigate. Forget all the other stuff, that if we solve these homicides, we might not have terrorism. If we solve these rapes, we might not have the homicides. That's how you make all communities safer. And besides that, we're solving the homicides and we're solving the rapes. So, that's the way we make a community safe, is by treating everybody, violence against anybody, as something that we have to take seriously.
I'm always, as a reporter, always listening for the story. And one of the things I hear in what you're saying is those homicides and rapes don't fit the story that serves someone.
Right.
So this story that we must protect our national security, who does that serve? Who is it that is able to gain power by that kind of story?
Well, first and foremost, the intelligence community, right? They're the ones who get the resources. They're the ones who get the authorities. And it's fascinating because the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover was an inveterate racist and misogynist. He didn't allow women, and was forced in the last couple of years of his directorship to admit black agents, but there were only a handful. But every year after he died, it got a little bit better. It was slow progress, and it never came close to meeting the demographics of our country, but you could see progress every year until 2001. 2001, that progress reverses every year. And even though Director Robert Mueller, who was director on 9/11, said, diversity in the FBI is a problem and we want to solve it, James Comey, the next director, said diversity is a crisis and we need to solve it, the lack of diversity. It got worse every year. And in fact, with women, women make up 20% of the FBI, but between 2013 and 2016, their representation in management at the FBI went down 40%.
And so we're talking about a time when there was a Democratic administration. And that one of the things as you think about this timeline is there were 8 years of Republican and then 8 years of a Democrat. Did anything shift for the better under the Obama administration?
No. And you have to understand about the FBI, part of it is we want an FBI that's somewhat independent. We want an FBI that the president doesn't tell what to do, right?
Yes.
So part of the church committee reforms was to give the FBI director a 10-year term, with the idea he would outlast a president and they wouldn't turn over at every administration. But limited at 10 years because they didn't want another J. Edgar Hoover,
right,
who was there 50 years and had such power no president could fire him. So this seemed like a good idea, a 10-year term. Well, Mueller actually started the week of 9/11, poor guy, and so his term came up in 2011, and the Obama administration asked Congress to pass a law that would allow him to serve 2 more years. Right? So it was kind of perplexing because they said, well, we don't want to have a big nomination fight in Congress. So instead, you're going to Congress and asking them to pass a law, that you don't understand. The 10-year limit wasn't to get rid of a good director. FBI directors can be fired by presidents, as we found out, at any time. They serve at the pleasure of the president. So the reason we had the 10-year cutoff was we didn't want a popular director staying more than 10 years, so that the Democratic administration kept him on, sent a message that we really want Republican leadership of the FBI, and then, of course, nominating James Comey, who was also a Republican, reinforced that it's this strange, I don't really understand. Republicans try to present Democrats as weak on national security issues. And the only people I think in the country who believe it are Democratic leaders. and so they're always nominating Republicans to these security positions, which kills them, because then they don't have a Democrat who you can say, here's the resume of this very experienced security person. And unfortunately, every FBI director in history has been Republican.
And it again gets to the stories that we're told and the stories that we tell ourselves then affect the actions.
Right, because, again, we have this fear that the people who are responsible for protecting us feel to an even greater degree every day. They're going in and seeing that there are bad people trying to do bad things. But who are they afraid of, right? They're just like every other human being. They're afraid of people who aren't like them. And so the resources get poured into investigating people from disenfranchised communities who are political activists challenging the government, because that looks scary to the government. So when you no longer have that criminal predicate, that requirement for objective evidence before I can start investigating somebody, well, this guy who's a protester, he's a dirty hippie, and oh my gosh, he's waving a communist flag, he's got to be the bad guy. We'll go after him. And these other protesters who look like me, and they're dressed in military clothes, and we have a bunch of ex-military in the FBI, that guy's a good guy, even though if you look at the history of these groups, those militia groups that I worked in the 1990s kill a lot of police officers. That's one of their main targets, the far right. So, this period we have where the police seem to be copacetic with these far right groups, I think is extremely dangerous for them, much less for the communities that end up being the victims of most of their violence.
This may have been going on and we just weren't aware of it, but I look at the recent events in Charlottesville, in Berkeley, and it does seem like what you're just talking about now is coming to bear in more terrible and frightening ways, that the police are siding with the white supremacists because they're white.
Right, and they're clever. They come there with the Blue Lives Matter flag, and they try to present themselves as friendly to law enforcement. But yeah, this is something that unfortunately I saw. I helped write a screenplay for a film, Imperium, with Daniel Radcliffe, and we have a scene in that film that could have been Charlottesville. I mean, the protest that there's violence on all sides, and that was filmed right outside of Richmond, Virginia, just a couple of hours from Charlottesville. It was filmed a year before Charlottesville happened, but so that's been a tactic for a long time. The white supremacist groups will go into a town to hold a rally knowing it's provocative, knowing that it will draw counter-protesters that they can then be violent against. And so this goes back to Nazi Germany, right? This is an old tactic. And for law enforcement not to be aware of it and not to understand this isn't people who are protesting. These are people with violent criminal records who are coming to these protests. And Charlottesville was about the 7th in a series that were getting more and more violent that I was watching. They weren't getting a lot of media attention outside the areas, but I was becoming increasingly worried that the police didn't seem to understand what was happening here and couldn't understand how we lost so much knowledge of how these groups work, since I worked there in the 1990s and we understood these groups and we understood what they were doing. So I'm extremely troubled by that, and I'm still now not convinced that law enforcement understands what they've awoken. Because when I was working undercover, the serious violent criminals wouldn't go to a public rally because they're criminals, right? They don't want to go someplace where there's going to be cameras, where they're going to be public. They're trying to hide. But now, because these people know that they can go to these rallies, beat somebody up, maybe stab them, maybe shoot them, and walk away and be able to go to the next rally, they feel that they have government sanction. The police are letting us do this. The police want us to do this violence. And that's going to be very dangerous because, number one, people are going to get killed at these rallies, as unfortunately we've seen. But number two, when there's an effort to finally put a lid on it, they're not going to react well to that. And I'm worried that that violence is going to get worse.
One thing that we saw after both Charlottesville and Berkeley was media and individuals identifying people and trying to find the perpetrators in ways that the police seemed not to be able to do.
And it's incredibly frustrating. You know, one of the reforms after 9/11 was to expand the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces so that, you know, we have more capability. They created these things called intelligence fusion centers where state and local law enforcement agencies could come and get the latest intelligence from the federal government, from the military. So we built all these systems, and yet somehow the information isn't getting to where it needs to go. Which again, it's part of it is just the ineffectiveness of those methodologies, but it does seem to be something different going on that I'm not really quite clear I have an answer to. But ProPublica has done a great amount of reporting on this, and they've done a great job. Sean King has done a lot of it. And it's fascinating because when I talk to law enforcement audiences, sometimes they'll say, well, you know, you're the First Amendment guy, these guys are just expressing themselves. And it's like, no. You know, I can show you pictures of the guy who's violent and show you his criminal record, right? This is a person who has been violent, has committed hate crimes, has committed other kinds of crimes. He's not going there to speak. He's going there beating people up. He's saying it on his social media. He's promoting the video as evidence of his toughness and going to the next protest. And how is it that you're not understanding? And these are interstate, so the FBI could be involved. But you look at a case like the J20, this is the January 20th, 2017 anti-Trump protest in Washington, D.C., where some windows got broken and somebody lit a limousine on fire, and the police closed off a block and arrested over 230 people who were there, including journalists, and then charged them all with felonies, and went through 3 sets of trials, all ending in acquittals. But how can 200 people get arrested when windows get broken and Charlottesville happen and we have 1 federal arrest coming out of that? I mean, it's really, I can't really understand what the thinking is behind that, and I worry that it is giving these groups the idea that they have sanction.
So probably everybody is feeling what I'm feeling, which is a sort of knot in the pit of my stomach as I hear all of these stories. But what is it that we as citizens can do to push against what's going on?
Organize. And
thank you, NJ11, for change.
And work together. I mean, you know, the Muslim American community was at the point of the spear after 9/11. The Latino community is you know, targeted now, but all of these communities, all of our communities are being impacted in some way. So it's a matter of reaching out to all the different communities to let them know that they're part of us. The other thing is, I think of it almost as the opposite of the civil rights movement, where you had recalcitrant state governments who wouldn't enforce the law. The federal government had to come and enforce them. Where here you have the federal government not enforcing the law, it's state and local governments that have to come protect our rights. And in San Francisco, an ordinance was passed because when the FBI's rules became so lax, they were actually more lax than the San Francisco Police Department. So citizens of San Francisco came to the supervisors and said, hey, how can these guys work on that task force if the rules are different there and looser? How can we be sure they're following city and state rules? So they passed an ordinance saying, San Francisco Police Department, you have to report what you're doing so that we know that you're following city rules. And they waited 3 years and finally just admitted that they couldn't certify that. So the San Francisco Police Department was taken out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Oakland then followed suit, filed an ordinance. Portland is now looking to come out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So this will have an impact, and it will force, because the FBI only has 12,000 agents across the whole country, spread around the world. It's a tiny agency for all the power that it has and the influence it has. And if they don't have state and local law enforcement working shoulder to shoulder with them, they can't do their job. So if the state and locals are saying your rules are too lax for us to participate, the only solution is for the FBI to raise their rules. And that, I think, is going to have a big impact, but it also just sends a message that, you know, here in our community, we don't have to go to Washington, D.C. to change FBI policy. We can change FBI policy right here in New Jersey, in New York, wherever we are.
And say, we still follow rules here.
Right, and we are going to protect the civil rights of our community, even if the federal government won't.
As individuals, are there ways for us to parse what's being told to us? I think about what's happening even this last week and this week with the reunification of children with their parents. And the government said, oh, this number, more than 100, can't be reunified because their parents are accused of criminal activity. Mm-hmm. And the ACLU said, what criminal activity? And they have gotten no answers. But the headlines are, there are criminals who can't be reunited with their children. How do we, as we read the newspapers, what do we need to bring to those stories to try to understand them?
I think we just need to be skeptical of everything, you know, and as skeptical of things that make us feel good, right, that tend to reinforce our ideas. That's part of the problem, is that, you know, we've moved into camps where we only listen to the people who are saying what we want. You know, I'm in this very strange position where there's something I agree with Devin Nunes on, the head of the that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act needs more oversight. Yes, I've been saying that for 20 years now. You know, I'm glad he's on board, even though I understand that his reason for being on board is inappropriate, and the one thing that he's complaining about is a completely bogus argument. But, you know, if we can make the public understand that, yes, there is a secret court in the United States of America that does what? Who knows what they do? Right? I mean, even in the FBI, you didn't get to know what they did if you weren't working on those cases. So how is it that the United States of America has a secret court? Right? This is something that the public should know. And so we're in this weird time where, you know, the FBI often does a good job, and everything I've seen about what they're doing right now with this investigation with the Carter Page files, it seems like they're checking all the boxes. You know, that was a big case, so you're going to make sure that you try to do things right. But the FBI is a very troubled institution and deserves a hard look. And, you know, Robert Mueller, I think, is the perfect guy to be the special counsel of this investigation, because he has bipartisan support, and he has, after being an FBI director for 12 years, he knows the levers to get the resources he needs. But he is not a perfect person. You can look in his history and see he has made some decisions that are very troubling. And I am not completely confident that everything he's going to do is going to be right. And we need to have better oversight of all of these institutions and recognize that they're supposed to be our public servants. And if we don't have a way of telling them what we expect of them, they're not public service. They're serving somebody's interest, but it's not necessarily ours.
And by oversight, I think about the story you told about Patrick Leahy actually going into all the
Right.
data. Is that the kind of oversight that, how do we oversee these sorts of institutions?
So when the church committee came out, there wasn't aren't intelligence committees, right? So one of the ideas was create committees in Congress that will have the responsibility for overseeing all intelligence activities. But unfortunately, they go behind the curtain and look at secret things. And are they stopping more programs or authorizing more programs? We don't know. Mm-hmm. We don't know what they're doing behind that closet. So there's no public oversight. And really what you need is public oversight, because that's the only way we have buy-in and we can have confidence. And one of the problems with what Donald Trump is doing now, where he's denigrating the intelligence agencies, is that it's easy for him to do that because they have not been honest and they have been so secretive that, yeah, they lied about torture, they lied about the surveillance programs. So how do I know they're not lying about this, right? And just anything that you're not able to take a hard look at, you're going to have some suspicions of. So it's very easy, Donald Trump deserves to be blamed for the way he's attacking these institutions, but these institutions have to be blamed too, because they've made their own bed by demanding things without having any kind of accountability.
And that, you mentioned how confusing this time is, and I think about, one day I'm calling to say, support the Mueller investigation, and another day I'm calling to say there needs to be more oversight on what's going, and so it does feel like the complexity of it becomes very difficult for many people to be able to wrap their arms around.
Right. The FISA is a perfect example of that. I mean, there's a lot of really smart lawyers at the ACLU and at the Brennan Center and former Department of Justice officials. And it's, we're about to go out and say something and we all look at each other and go, do we have this right? Right? It's so complicated. And so much of it is secret that you don't understand, even if you can understand the letter of the law, how it's actually implemented in practice. So it's very difficult, and that's part of how they're able to keep this facade up that there should be a part of your government you shouldn't ask questions about. Just trust they're doing the right thing. And maybe you're lucky enough to live in a community where they're protecting that community, but a lot of Americans aren't. And we can't say we're protecting the national security if those communities aren't protected too. And it's even worse when those communities are actually the ones that are being targeted in the name of national security.
So much of what you've talked about tonight, Mike, gets down to something that I never thought I would be talking about in a political conversation, which is values. And I think about accountability and even curiosity. I hear a lot of closed-mindedness and the value of caring for one another. What are the ways that we can continue to focus on those as we fight against this encroachment of lack of oversight and a kind of ability to do anything without accountability?
I think it's building community, that we have to look at ourselves, and unfortunately technology today, it's easy to get into your phone or whatever cable channel you're watching and take the train into work and come back out, and we all have busy lives. But recognizing that there are people hurting in our community, we can alleviate a lot of that suffering without going far away, without petitioning to Congress, and addressing these things. And once you do that, you're building the fabric of society. So when somebody like President Trump says Muslims are the problem in the United States, you can say, no, I have Muslim neighbors who I know, and they're lovely people, right? And when ICE is raiding some place and saying these people are bad people, you can say, no, I know those people, so I can go help them get attorneys. I can go resist that activity. That it takes that being a community that that makes us understand that it's not, that the us and them is not, shouldn't divide our community. We should realize we're all us, and we need to protect all of us.
Well, this seems like a perfect place to turn to this community and open it up for questions. Thank you, especially for bringing us to this idea of community.
Thank you.
And we have time for a couple of questions, and we have a microphone. And so, yes, over here.
Hi, how you doing?
Very
My
good.
name's Paul Casella. Thank you for coming. I have two quick well, one's quick. First question, what office did you work out of for the FBI? In what city?
I worked out of the Santa Ana Resident Agency outside of Los Angeles. It was the
Okay.
Los Angeles office. I worked out of the Boston office, but I worked in the Providence RA.
Okay.
I worked at the Atlanta office, and I worked out of the Seattle office too. I did undercover work, so I got moved around.
I was just a little curious about that, because I heard that the New York office has been a problem.
Right.
But my second question is, there's a book that I read recently. It's called Messing with the Enemy. It's by Clint Watts.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a chapter in the book that's really interesting. He talks about how the internet has played such a role in dividing us. Where we thought the internet was going to bring us together, and it did in its infancy. Right now, the internet is one of our biggest enemies as far as dividing the people, because of a thing he calls preference bubbles, which is anybody can get whatever they want on the internet without having to deal with another human being. And everyone ends up being in their own corner. The people that listen to Fox News, that's where they get their news from. And that's
Right.
what they believe.
Right.
So there's no interaction, human interaction between anybody. Do you have any ideas about what we might be able to do to kind of like work towards making this better? Because I don't see any, from what I have read, I don't see how it's going to get better.
Well, I have to say, I see, right here, in this room. I mean,
Absolutely.
I'm not, but this
Absolutely.
is part of how we do
Absolutely.
that. But
Right.
I'm sure you've got some,
So one of the things I'm concerned with, and I'm always concerned when I speak, because everybody, I always get, oh my gosh, I'm terrified now. I don't want to be, people
Yeah.
make bad decisions when they're afraid. We are living in an incredibly peaceful time in the United States. The amount of terrorist attacks and terrorist fatalities in the 1970s, some of you look old enough to remember with me, that was worse. Homicides were worse. We live in a very safe time. The internet has provided wonderful information, ways that homebound people can experience museums and all kinds of good things. So we have to keep in mind that there are good things that are coming from this, and that those are helping build community as well. But I do recognize there is this problem. I'm just afraid the way that problem gets presented, the answer becomes censorship. And I'm extremely troubled by that, even when it's companies doing it and not the government, because the voices they silence tend not to be the ones that the people in this room, I think, are concerned about, right? And there was some attempts after Charlottesville, the police need more power to go after Nazis. And I had to call all the people working on it and say, I was an FBI agent in the 1990s. We went after Nazis. We had all the power we needed. This is a choice that the government is making. And if you give them more power, they're not going to choose something different. They're going to continue using those powers against people they don't like. So, what we have to do is just hold them responsible for what they're doing. Why is it that a journalist can identify who these people are who are on tape committing felonies in Charlottesville and elsewhere, and the police aren't reacting quickly to that? There was Huntington Beach was one of the previous ones to Charlottesville, where if you read even the Los Angeles Times afterwards, Antifa and Trump supporters clash, right? This both sides thing, where it's on videotape. You can watch the whole thing from a lot of different angles. And what it was a group of hardcore people with violent criminal records attacking journalists. The so-called Antifa were trying to protect the journalists. So the journalists had cameras, and they've been sending to the police, here are the people who beat us up. Here are their criminal records. Here's who they are. When are you going to arrest them? And they haven't. And that's a choice that they're making.
And was this local police? Or was
So it was state because it was
police?
on a state park. But the FBI could work that too, right?
Right.
I mean, these aren't hard things. If you're beating somebody up, there's laws against that. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
My name is Alan Saltzman. President Obama just about a week ago talked about that we should be afraid of authoritative dictators taking over, and leading the world. And I think you talk about how we're living in an authoritative quagmire, and that's causing a lot of the problems.
Right.
Okay, but how do you stop that when people, rightly or wrongly, and I think wrongly, look to somebody who's authoritative to protect them,
Right.
okay? And the authoritative figure wants to maintain their control, and I keep on referring to Nazism.
Right.
And that situation.
Right, and Donald Trump is no genius, right? These tools that are being used, the demonization of the media, the fake news, the attacks on institutions, these are what authoritarians have used for generations, right? This is all, the terrorists aren't brilliant in their strategy. They just understand this is how human beings are. And once we create this fear, so what we have to do is address the fear and recognize that we are strong. We're strong communities. We don't have anything to fear, and what we have to do is make sure our representatives know what we expect, and that we expect them to be protecting our communities, not vilifying them. And I think that's the way you start pushing back, but it is very dangerous, and particularly when, as you said, people are going into these cubby holes and they believe, but that predated Trump too. I mean, the whole birther thing with President Obama and that kind of nonsense. So none of this is new. It's just how we have to react to it, and we also have to hold the media responsible. I mean, I don't understand when we have 24-hour news stations, they're all talking about the same thing every hour on repeat, right? We have, about 8 wars going on that the United States is involved in? When's the last time you saw something that did a deep dive on what we're doing in any of those countries, right? I mean, we're not getting the information we deserve to be able to influence what our government policies are, and that's where authoritarians get to step in and take control of these institutions.
And it is interesting, you said we're living in a very peaceful time, and yet people are primed to be very afraid.
And 9/11 was a perfect storm, right? I mean, that was a horrific attack that came out of the blue sky on a nice summer morning. So, I can understand how that fear was generated, but it's fascinating to watch the polling because fear of terrorism drops off sharply, spikes after 9/11, but then drops off sharply, bottoming out around 2004. By 2013, it's back up to where it's approaching right after 9/11. By 2016 in the election, most Americans said that's their number one concern. Even though in that time period, there hadn't been any reason for Americans to be afraid again. It was just the repetition and this strange position where the intelligence communities who are supposed to be protecting from us are the ones who are scaring us, right? They're the ones saying, ISIS, 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 you got to give us more power so we can go after ISIS. There's not a single case of a person who was trained in an ISIS terrorist training camp in the Middle East who came here and harmed anyone. Not a single case. And yet that took up every news moment for years prior to the election. And I think that had a big impact on the way Donald Trump was able to exploit that fear and get in charge.
And the color threat levels, yellow, red.
Right.
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Ariel Zeitlin, and I'm a reference librarian. So when I hear you talk, I want to just verify what I'm understanding. So it's as if when you say that before you had a criminal predicate for targeting subjects of investigation, you're saying your search strategy was based on somebody having performed criminal acts
No, not necessarily.
or having a criminal.
So, criminal predicate. So it's just a reasonable suspicion this person is going to break a federal law.
Okay.
So
And-
that reasonable suspicion might be, I saw him buy a ski mask, and I saw him casing the bank, and
Okay.
I saw him buy a gun. Okay.
Okay.
A reasonably skeptical police officer might say, maybe that guy's up to no good. Right, but they
Okay.
haven't committed a crime yet.
All right, so, but once you take away the criminal predicate as your search strategy and you widen the search strategy, so it's like you're going on Google instead of doing a proper search on a search engine, you're going to get thousands and thousands of results. So is that what happened, that we became increasingly less safe because our search strategy was too wide for us to really monitor those results?
Right, and couple that, so there's more authority to investigate, coupled with the Patriot Act opening up collection and other, so you have this flood of information coming in, and so how the government reacted to that is profiling, right? We can't look at everybody, so who are we afraid of? We're afraid of this group, we're afraid of that group, so we're going to profile.
So
And
it
this,
stopped being a criminal predicate and it became racial profiling that narrowed
racial,
down.
ideological,
That
all
was
kinds
the
of
filter, the filters that started being used.
Right, so in 2014, the Obama administration codified a policy the FBI had implemented in December of 2008. So just as the Obama administration is coming in, they implement a program, they very carefully try to mask by calling it the Racial and Ethnic Mapping Program. Right? I believe that program was illegal. And I told the Obama administration's Justice Department, look, here are the rules that are the Justice Department rules. This is clearly illegal the way the FBI is doing this. In 2014, the Justice Department changed the rules to authorize it. So there is in this country a racial and ethnic mapping program run by the FBI where they map every community by race. And they're not map makers, right? They're not drawing pretty pictures to put on the wall. They're drawing those lines because they're treating people on one side differently than the way they're treating the other people on the other side. And that is, in my mind, community profiling, right? That is exactly what we don't expect them to do.
So-
And that's why it's even more important. It's a crisis that there's very lack of diversity within the agency itself.
Right, exactly. When you have very few people inside to say, kind of like when Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the brother of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, went on trial. At one point, the FBI agent was putting up his tweets to show how dangerous he was. And the defense attorney had to point out to him, that's actually a 50 Cent lyric. That's not really a political statement.
Yeah.
Where
And if
somebody,
it is, it'll be
you know,
thousands of people making the same statement.
With the FBI being less diverse, there's less pushback within the agency about who they're targeting. And the perfect example is Terry Albury, who was the only black agent in Minneapolis who was working at the airport and saw a program. The government alleges he's the one who leaked the information. He pled guilty and he's in prison now because he according to the government, leaked information about a program to target people from Yemen coming off planes to try to coerce them into being informants, and other FBI programs of racial profiling. And what his lawyer said was he had a crisis because there was nobody that he could talk to. He was on this island seeing something that he knew was wrong, but that his colleagues thought was just fine, and the only way he thought he could do something was letting the public know. And, you know, he's in prison. And as far as we know, I'm not aware that that program has stopped.
I think we have time for one.
Well, I think someone over there,
Over.
someone there. I want to squeeze one.
Okay, great.
Okay, hi. Perlmutter. And you've spoken a lot about all of the data that's being collected with the more power, and that there are cues and clues in this data, like for Parkland. Can you imagine a way, in your greatest imagination, how some group or task force can pull that data together to find those kernels?
Great questions. Thank you for asking that question, because when I talk to police audiences, I tell them there's a way to do that, you know, you're basically having triage, right? You have a lot of possible threats. You have to triage them somehow. So right now it's accidental. So the FBI was warned about Tamerlan Tsarnaev. It did a little investigation. It put him on the watch list. He had told them he wasn't going to Russia. Watch list pings when he buys his ticket to go to Russia. Pings again when he goes to the airport. The CIA had sent a note to the airport saying, if this guy shows up at an airport, detain him until we can question him. He's allowed to fly without being questioned. He comes back, the watch list pings again, nothing. And then he goes off and does the bombing. Now, what the agency said was, we had too much information that day. So he was going through JFK, and the customs people said there were too many people who were on the watch list that day, so we couldn't stop them all, right? So it's this accidental triage, right, where I would imagine that not all of those people that they were looking at, the direction was detain him on site at an airport, right? So you have to have some kind of triage, and my explanation or argument is use reasonable suspicion, right? If you have a standard where you say, somebody might say that guy's squirrely, all right, that doesn't help me any. I have a guy here who a foreign government has told me he's in communication with active militants and has a plan to travel there and join them. All right, that's reasonable suspicion. I can now suspect that that guy's doing something, so I'm going to prioritize him over somebody on the subway saw a package left alone. All right, could that be a bomb? Yeah, it could. But chances are, no, that's going to be somebody left their backpack when they left. And if we put all our resources in chasing that low-level stuff, then when something real happens, it's going to get past us. So those standards weren't just there to protect the innocent. They're there to make the government more effective and more efficient in who they look for. So it's a standard that the government should want because it makes them better, rather than what they sold, which was we should have no limits in what we collect or who we target.
Maybe over here. Oh, sorry. Actually, if we could pass the mic. Sorry, I pointed to this person here, and then we'll go to you, if that's okay. Sorry.
I have a couple of things that are related to how to make things change. And two examples I wrote down is if the police don't arrest the guilty one, where you said they've been pointed out and they don't arrest them, what could be done? And the other one was, how do we get media to talk about the important things? So this is just two questions of many. How do we really make those things change?
Sure. So we all have a voice, and we have to use it. The New York Daily News, since I complained about the military, I'll tell a good story about the military, about the press. I'll tell a good story about the press. In 2013, New York Daily News did a story about homicides in New York City. New York City does better than the national average. They solve about 75% of the homicides. But the Daily News went further and broke it down by borough. If you're murdered in Manhattan, 89% chance that's going to get solved. Move outside to the outer boroughs, it drops significantly. If you are a white victim, 85% chance that's going to be solved, 20 points above the national average. If you are a Latino victim, it drops to 55, 10 points below the national average. If you're a black victim, it drops to 45, right? So they went further than that and analyzed where homicide cops work. If you're murdered in Manhattan, 15 detectives are going to be assigned to that murder. If you're murdered in Brooklyn or the Bronx, 2 or 3, right? So this is resource choices that the government's making that are opaque to most of us, except for that great reporting. And, you know, I've been telling that story since 2013 when it came out. It's now 2018, and it's getting a little old. Well, that was a long time ago. I would love that the Daily News, which now I think is going to be doing even less of that, but, you know, that kind of reporting is what we need so we as citizens can say, you know, I could see a mayor of New York saying, look, if murders and homicide are unsolved, tourists won't come to New York, and if tourists don't come to New York, the people in Brooklyn and the Bronx are going to get hurt just as bad as people in Manhattan, so we have to put more resources there. I could see that argument, but is 15 versus 3 detectives on a homicide the right ratio? I want to see a public debate about that, and us as a community to decide, no, our neighbors in Brooklyn and the Bronx need protection as well, and we want to make sure that we're solving the crimes that affect them. And I'm sorry, your second one was with the...
The other was getting the media to talk about the important things.
You know, again, using your voice and changing the channel. You know, I mean, a lot of these, they depend on the clicks. And if you start looking out for, and I tend to be skeptical of every, you know, it's my training as an investigator. I want to see it. And there are a lot of really good outlets out there that are tiny, that are bloggers, who they are focused on one issue, and they know that issue backwards and forwards, and they're keeping up with it every day. And you can get that information that never gets up to the big news stations, but you can learn a lot about what's going on, and particularly with local communities, because local journalism has suffered so much in this change that, you know, making sure that you're supporting your local bloggers, that you're making sure you're supporting any local journalism, because that's going to be what affects your community most directly.
Hi, thank you. You talked about the importance of organizing by private citizens, and you also talked about widespread data collection practices and that being subject to abuse. Well, one of the primary ways that groups like this organize is through social media platforms like Facebook. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, is there something that we should be concerned about the amount of information we're putting out there through social media groups and expressing our opinions on views? There's the threat of censorship, but there's also the threat of physical violence, perhaps, and other concerns.
So I wish I could say that shouldn't be a concern, because I want you to continue organizing, but of course, you know, in this environment, we have to be careful and, you know, particularly make sure that if you're collecting data, that you're doing that with the consent of the people whose data is collected. But, you know, this, I think, is just a time where we're all going to have a little courage and do what we need to do to make sure that the communities are protected. And there's always risk in any kind of political activity, but I think the way you mitigate that risk is by being louder, not by being quieter.
And by sticking together.
Right.
Which, you know, when we spoke on the phone, you talked about solidarity as being one of the ways that we will be able to make change.
Right, and you know, when it's happening to any one of us in the community, it's happening to all of us. And so you have to answer those calls and go, you know, make sure that you're standing up for their rights as well.
I'll let you,
And I think, was there someone?
someone over. Oh, behind you? Oh, sorry.
Hi, Kevin Coughlin, Morristown Green, local blogger. I want to follow up on a couple of things you said.
Thank you.
Two quick things. You said there were a couple of things about Robert Mueller that trouble you. I'd like to know what those are. And secondly, what do you think will happen when Donald Trump fires Mueller?
It depends on how far back you want to go. He was a career Justice Department guy climbing the ladder. I don't know, some of you are as old as I am. Remember the bank, BCCI, the Bank of Commercial Credit International, that we called the Bank of Crooks and Criminals International. Even William Safire, very conservative Republican columnist for the New York Times, said that he believed that Robert Mueller, who was then head of the criminal division, was responsible for slow-walking that case because it impacted the intelligence agencies, because it wasn't just crooks and criminals, it was also spy agencies that were using this very lax and undisciplined money laundering services. And so there was a hearing, John Kerry, his classmate from prep school, criticized him severely with the way the Justice Department handled that case, again, with this idea that maybe what they were trying to do was protect intelligence assets. Obviously, this case involves a lot of intelligence assets, and so I'm concerned that there will be an effort to not look at some things that might make people other than the subjects of the investigation look bad. He was the FBI director when they started the warrantless wiretapping programs, right? That Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act comes with a criminal penalty for breaking that law. Why didn't the FBI, the law enforcement agency, say no? The torture program started. Now, FBI agents are trained interrogators. They had some of the best interrogators in the world. Why were they not part of creating the interrogation program? They weren't part of creating the interrogation program because they didn't want interrogators. They wanted torturers. And that's, they went out and CIA hired these two psychologists who had never interrogated anyone, much less knew anything about Al-Qaeda, where you had FBI agents who knew what they were doing and why they weren't pushed to the front. And part of it is I hold the FBI more responsible because I know how good that agency can be and how effective they can be, and why they weren't in those instances, I think, comes from leadership. So I have questions about his leadership. Again, and I wrote a piece for Time Magazine where I said, I feel like he was an appropriate pick for that job because I can't think of anyone who has access to the tools, has bipartisan support, has public respect. But I don't think we can just sit back and wait for him to do the right thing. We have to hold him responsible just like we would any other prosecutor. And as far as if President Trump fired him, I'm not very good at predicting things. So, it's just a terrible situation right now. And I'm more concerned with that things aren't coming out quickly enough. I'm fascinated that this FISA warrant or FISA application that came out, that's the first time in the history of the FISA court an application has been released. First time ever, which is a great thing for me, right? I want to see all of them. We've been using this power. How is it used? Maybe we're going to be really impressed, like most people were when they viewed this one. Right? That, wow, there's really a lot of detail in here. There's really clear explanation of what's going on. This seems entirely appropriate. So if there's a good story to tell, these agencies should be happy to tell it. But my concern is that's not necessarily the norm. And I want to make sure that as we're moving forward with the enforcement of the law, that there's enough information available to the public so we can understand this is true. I think because so much is secret, it's easy for for Trump and his supporters to fill the gaps. You know, it's kind of like with the 9/11 situation, where because the government was trying to keep so much secret, this conspiracy theory developed that, oh, it was really the government who did this, you know, these things, but it was the government leaving that room for that. And these agencies have left that room for Donald Trump and his supporters to say this entire thing is illegitimate, and I think that's a problem. And, you know, hopefully we'll get to see the information and the public will be able to decide.
Lori,
I think we have one there.
okay.
You just need to make these quick. and then
Yeah,
I'm
I'm sorry,
gonna
tend to
Okay.
go on.
I appreciate your pointing out the skepticism and looking at ineptness and opaqueness in an agency that we want to build trust. My concern is what's happening in our nation about this exploitation of distrust in this agency. And so you raise healthy skepticism.
Right.
We're having an intelligent dialogue here, but our nation often speaks from emotion and irrationality. And my concern is for our country to prevent any kind of anarchy with a leader that really is pushing distrust and really to discredit what the FBI is doing. So can you please address what can be positive of turning this around and not to see our country, where a portion of our population is saying it's okay if Trump colluded with Putin?
So you know, I'm watching it just like you. Obviously, I don't have any inside information, and it's fascinating to watch at the summit in Finland and how that changed so many minds. And it was because they could see it. They could see, oh, you know, this guy is being subservient to the Russian leader. You know,
That it was the body language, not the words.
But it was the words too.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, you know, that the President of the United States is saying bad things about the intelligence community in the presence
Yeah.
of a hostile foreign dictator is astonishing. And I think it was astonishing, and that's when I think you started to see some of the people who had been, you know, saying this wasn't a thing, all of a sudden go, wait a minute, something's going on, but there needs to be more. And, you know, as much as I want to make sure that we're protecting the integrity of the Mueller investigation, you know, they've got to start giving the public information, because they're building a pretty good case in that conspiracy theory zone. And, you know, part of it to me is why it's taking this long when this is all stuff that happened before 2016, right? I mean, the things that the Manafort is charged with go 10 years before that, right? Why is it that somebody can go to a foreign country, come back with tens of millions of dollars, and nobody's asking questions, right? Or the questions they're asking don't appear to be the right one, where, you know, they're spending a lot of time investigating people who really aren't doing anything bad. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed too. But it takes the institutions, that's what the institution has control over. And they need to start making sure that what they are presenting to the public is accurate in all cases, right? I mean, they lost the J20 cases because they were hiding evidence from the defense. They lost the Bundy cases because they were hiding evidence from the defense, right? There's actually a law against hiding evidence from the defense in a trial, right? So if the government will hide evidence in those cases, how do we know they're not hiding evidence in these cases? They're undermining their own integrity and the confidence that we can have, and they need to clean that up. And it's going to take independent oversight, which they resist, but it's going to take us demanding that our local representatives and our national representatives actually do it and are focused on doing it right rather than the show that's going on. And you know, if you look at the way the Senate Intelligence Committee is doing this, they're much more effective. Mm-hmm. And even the House Intelligence Committee, if you watched any of those hearings, you get a lot of information, right? And you can make your own determination about whether this person's telling the truth or not. And, you know, I know that we then go back to our bubbles, but at least there's a place where objective information is being exposed.
Really quick. As an activist, some days and after some actions, I do get scared and I do get nervous, and I wanted to know how afraid I do need to be, if at all. I'm very out there. You know, a lot of us, we have our buttons on us and we confront people and we put postings on Facebook. Are you ever afraid, and have you had any backlash since you've spoken out in these lecture series?
So yeah, I've been afraid. You know, I was undercover with neo-Nazis. So I've been fighting authoritarianism for a long time.
I think your mic.
Sorry. After you praised me for my microphone skills.
It lasted for almost
time. Yeah, exactly. I used to have them taped to my body. It was easier. Not that they didn't
We'll
fail
do that
there,
next
too,
time,
yeah.
but this time we're doing it.
Yeah. So you know, I think again, is there a risk? Of course, there's a risk, but we have to do it. That's the only way we're going to take back control of our government. Thank you very much.
Well, I know, Lori, do you still have a question?
I know, that seemed like the perfect
Feels like
ending.
this is a perfect ending point, but
All right.
you get to ask.
I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't ask this, and so I'm asking you in advance to forgive me for asking it.
Sure.
But from your perspective, what the hey happened in the election? What happened with Comey talking about one, you know, investigation of Clinton and not Trump? And what's your take on all of that?
So the idea that you know, the Trump supporters say that the FBI was trying to help Hillary Clinton is hilarious to anybody who knows anything about the FBI.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to understand, the FBI investigated Bill Clinton since he started running for president. There were FBI investigations against him, and they continue to this day. I mean, it's amazing that that family is the most investigated family in the United States. So the idea that there was a group of Clintonites within the FBI, I think, is silly. You know, I think I wish I could understand what Jim Comey was thinking, and his explanations make no sense. Where, you know, to the extent he felt that he needed to be radically transparent, in most cases I'm in favor of that. But there's a rule against making disparaging comments about people you haven't charged with a crime, because they don't have a way to defend themselves, right? You charge them with a crime, they go to court, they can defend themselves. If you just say, all right, we didn't have evidence they committed a crime, but they were bad, you know, what do you do? So that was so far beyond, you know, if you read Rod Rosenstein's memo, I think he had it exactly right, that this was just so far beyond the bounds of what anyone in the Justice Department should have done, that it was crazy in July, right? Much less what he did in
October.
Well, even September. I mean,
Yeah.
testifying in front of Congress and
That's
just,
true.
you know, completely on and on and on. Yeah, exactly. So his explanation makes no sense. And then conversely, you know, if somebody had come to me and said, a person who has a clearance had a personal computer and they might have had some classified information on it, and if they did have classified information on it, that might have been stolen by somebody because it's not being protected by the intelligence community. All right, is that a national security issue? Sure, worth investigating. Okay, here we have the Russian government is attacking a Democratic Party campaign computers and trying to influence our election. That's a 4-alarm fire.
Yeah.
right? I mean, that is all hands on deck. There is something very bad here. That they were so slow to react to that is astonishing to me. And again, we're still years out trying to put it together. It's like, what do we have an intelligence community for if it's not to protect us from a hostile foreign nation messing up our elections? I mean, it's astonishing what a catastrophic, that's 9/11 style failure of intelligence, you know, because no matter what comes of the Mueller investigation, we're going to have a segment of Americans who believe that this case was all made up and that Donald Trump was legitimately elected and everything is a conspiracy of the deep state to take it away. And if Mueller comes and doesn't indict, you're going to have a section of Americans who think this is all a fix from the beginning and we've completely lost our government and we have no legitimacy in our government. And I don't know how you put that egg back together. And, you know, it certainly is going to take all of us working together. And I believe it's not going to come from the federal government. I mean, all you have to do is look at anything they're doing at any level of the federal government, that we have to start it from the ground up and retake control.
All right, that's a good place to end. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for being here. Thanks to everybody here and to New Jersey 11 for Change for putting this together. And I just want to let all of you know that this is the first of several conversations we're going to be having, and that I think the next one, we're still putting it together, will be about something we talked a lot about tonight, which is about the importance of a free press in democracy. So I hope you'll be here for that one too. Thank you.
Thank you.